Hi everyone, Joe Kral, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. As always, I hope you've been enjoying these weekly pro-life sessions. I hope you've been learning a lot about pro-life public policy. And again, if you haven't already subscribed, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below. Give us a big thumbs up, and don't ever hesitate to share with your friends. As I always say, the more informed a pro-life advocate becomes, the more powerful the argument becomes for them. And we want all of our friends to become powerful pro-life advocates. So, again, be sure to share this video and spread the word, spread the gospel, if you will. We always appreciate it. This week's topic, we're going to be talking about unborn victims of violence laws and legislation. A lot of things have happened over the course of the decades that have led up to legislation like this. And I think it's important. We have a lot of states out there that there's a kind of a mix of laws, if you will, out there. You have some laws that only treat the unborn as a victim of a crime from the moment of viability onward. Some are with quickening. Some are at the moment of conception even. So there's a pretty big mix out there, if you will, with respect to that. Now, typically when I speak of an unborn victims of violence law, I'm certainly advocating for those laws where the unborn from the moment of conception can be treated as a person and a victim as of a crime that is committed. And so I think it's important if you live in a state that does not recognize the unborn from the moment of conception in their unborn victims of violence law. We really need to amend that to cover those children from the moment of conception. That's an important thing. But let's talk a little bit about this as well. A little historical background to give you a little bit more insight into why we need this law and so forth. Again, we'll start with Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade in many ways is much of the basis of many of our pro-life arguments on public policy. And again, when Roe v. Wade was decided, certainly not only was the issue of abortion virtually wiped off all the books, so any prohibition on abortion that had existed was simply wiped off. But it certainly started instilling this idea, this insane idea, that the preborn person cannot receive any rights whatsoever because, simply put, as Planned Parenthood and other pro-abortion advocates try to argue, the unborn are not persons, and so they're not subject to rights. Well, this is sort of a ludicrous notion, and one of the things to always note is that reality certainly has a way of showing the absurdity of the pro-abortion argument. And sometimes it does it in the most tragic sorts of ways. And so what do we do in these cases where we see this? So for example, a woman who has decided to keep her baby is tragically injured due through the criminal negligence of another. Maybe she was held up at gunpoint or a drunk driver hit her, something. And her unborn child is either harmed, injured, or even dies. In some states, if the child dies or is harmed or is injured, just simply put, no criminal activity can be brought on behalf of that unborn child. No crime. Essentially what it boils down to is that the unborn child, since in some of those states it's considered a non-person, doesn't have any rights, and so no charges are brought against the perpetrator on behalf of that unborn child. And so that's a travesty. I think many people see the travesty in this, and certainly one of the most famous cases involving this sort of thing, the Laci Peterson case, where her husband Scott Peterson murdered her, and her unborn child died as a result of her murder. Again, kind of highlights in many respects why we need such laws. We see these two people, Connor Peterson, the name of the baby, and Laci Peterson, the name of the wife who was killed, as victims. Most people see this as victims, and certainly the mothers who keep their children and want to keep their children see their children as victims of horrible crimes that are committed, where they either lose a child or the child is injured. And so, in many ways, we see this backdrop for this type of legislation. Now, really, the I guess you could say the trailblazer for this sort of legislation comes from the state of Missouri. And what they did was is they amended their preamble to their constitution to recognize unborn children, especially in cases of crimes. They recognized that this can only be applied in lieu of what the U.S. Constitution says and what the Supreme Court says. But nonetheless, basically, it was implemented to ensure that women who are wanting to keep their kids and are tragically victimized, and their unborn children are tragically victimized, that those perpetrators can be charged with two crimes because there are two persons, if you will. Obviously, this makes its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court rules in the favor of Missouri. Missouri was very clever. They simply said, well, it's not prohibiting the right to abortion. And there's certainly nothing that limits the state's rights to ensure that the child is protected, especially in the cases in which a woman who wants to keep her child. And so we see the impetus for unborn victims of violence legislation at this point. And so we see many states begin to pass such legislation, especially from the moment of conception onward. Now, one of the things that we need to consider, and this actually goes back to an article I wrote way back in, I believe it was like 2001. It was called One Victims or Two. And really what we see here and what we got to understand here is that the reality, the metaphysical reality that we're dealing with, is the fact is that you have an unborn person that exists, that it's an individual member of the species Homo sapiens. It's a living being. And so in many ways, we certainly metaphysically, again, define it as a person. And so this person deserves rights. Now, albeit they're very limited rights, and it's certainly a step forward, and I'll get to that here towards the end of the video. This is definitely indeed a step forward because the law begins to recognize the rights of the unborn child, that there are legitimate interests regarding the unborn child and protecting the unborn child. And so we have two victims here. One, we're dealing with the reality that there is indeed an unborn child, that this unborn child exists, that this unborn child is a person, and as a person, it certainly has rights. And so the Missouri preamble, as I said a moment ago, was really the trailblazer that really, in many cases, gave the impetus, if you will, for the many other states out there to pass such legislation. Now, let me be clear here too, because many states where they do try to pass this type of legislation, pro-abortion advocates try to come back with counter legislation. What we call the one victim approach legislation, where it's enhanced penalties for causing injury to a pregnant woman. And let me simply say in many ways why they promote this type of legislation. And it's a very simple. It's one of those aha moments for a lot of people. The big reason why we see this sort of push from pro-abortion advocates like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, and so forth, is for the fact that they don't want any sort of recognition of the unborn child under the law. And there's a simple reason for it. It's the camel's nose is under the tent sort of situation in which they realize good and well that once you start recognizing the rights of the unborn child, this is something that can definitely lead to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Again, let me just kind of give you a quick example. It is very possible that a case may arise at some point in time in some state somewhere where a criminal who has perpetrated a crime against an unborn child and the mother has his court case literally make its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this could be a decision for the U.S. Supreme Court to simply say, well, if the rights of the child can be recognized here, if we recognize that a child has a right to be safe from criminals, we should recognize that this is indeed a person and it's subject to all rights that all living human beings have. And so it's very probable and certainly very possible that a case such as this that challenges such a law could eventually make its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court and eventually overturn Roe v. Wade and so forth. And so, this is a promising sort of thing in many respects. Now, one of the things to also know is I always talk about incrementalism and the good things from incrementalism and so forth. One of the things that we need to understand is when we talk about limiting the harm of legalized abortion, one of the things that, one of those harms, if you will, that is out there right now that certainly pro-abortion advocates are trying to advocate and push for is this idea that the unborn child is not a person and deserves no rights. And so legislation like this certainly puts that argument to rest. The simple fact is, if we recognize the unborn child that has rights, we've limited one harm of Roe v. Wade. Because what happens? We see a child that now has rights, right? How does this move people towards a general acceptance of a pro-life attitude, a culture of life, if you will? Well, in my honest opinion, it basically does this. Law is a great teacher. One of the things that we can say is that this law certainly gives the impression that the unborn child indeed has rights, and if it's worthy from protection from criminals, it should be worthy to have protection from abortionists as well. And we begin to see kind of a general acceptance. Well, if we're going to say that an unborn child is a person and worthy from protection from criminals, in many cases, we need to recognize that this child is indeed worthy of all protection from all sorts of violence that may be perpetrated against it. So I think in that way, it certainly helps move society towards a culture of life. Again, thank you so much for watching. We're over the 12-minute mark now, so I need to sign off. But if you have any questions, be sure to write them down below in the comment. Again, if you can donate anything to help the society out, please do. I'll have a link down below as well. Again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a blessed weekend. God bless. Bye-bye.